No one in the room could have predicted that a simple act of kindness would change Amara Johnson's life forever. But when she offered Joe Rogan a cup of coffee during a high-stakes meeting, she unknowingly set off a chain of events that would test her strength, character, and determination. What happened next left everyone speechless, and the consequences were impossible to ignore. The hum of conversation filled the glass-walled conference room of Sterling Dynamics, blending with the faint sounds of traffic from the city streets below. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the polished mahogany table where the company's top executives sat poised for what promised to be a defining moment for their business. At the head of the table sat Jonathan Ellis, the company's CEO. His gaze, sharp and calculating, moved slowly over the room as if assessing the readiness of each person present. Every detail of this meeting had been meticulously planned, except for the unpredictable presence of their guest. The room fell silent as the door opened. Joe Rogan stepped inside, his presence instantly commanding attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, and composed, he moved with the confidence of someone used to holding the spotlight. As he stepped forward, his eyes swept the room, missing nothing. "Thanks for having me," Joe said, shaking Jonathan's hand. Jonathan's smile was thin. "Welcome, Mr. Rogan. We appreciate you taking the time." From her position near the refreshments table, Amara Johnson adjusted the polished silver coffee pot with practiced grace. Her role was clear: ensure that guests were comfortable and remain invisible. Yet as she poured coffee into delicate porcelain cups, she couldn't shake the sense that this meeting carried an unspoken tension, one that seemed to thicken the air with every passing second. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Let's begin," he announced, signaling the start of the presentation. "Our proposal outlines the potential synergies between our platforms. With the right alignment, we can expand our reach into demographics that have previously been out of our grasp." Joe leaned back slightly, listening with polite interest. Yet beneath his composed exterior, there was a glint of curiosity, an awareness of the power dynamics playing out beneath the surface. As slides flicked across the screen, Jonathan's voice grew sharper. "Mr. Rogan, while your platform certainly has reach, its unfiltered nature presents challenges for a brand of our stature. How do you propose we navigate that?" Joe tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "People trust what's real," he replied. "They're tired of curated narratives. That's why my platform works. I don't tell people what to think. I let them hear different perspectives and decide for themselves. And yet that approach has attracted more than its share of controversy," Jonathan replied smoothly. Joe's smile didn't waver. "Controversy happens when you challenge the status quo. But in the long run, honesty builds loyalty." Silence settled over the table as the unspoken challenge hung in the air. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Rogan?" Amara asked, her voice clear and composed despite the pulse that beat heavily in her chest. Joe glanced her way, his smile warm and genuine. "That'd be great, thanks." As Amara approached, she felt Jonathan's gaze shift toward her, sharp, assessing, and something darker she couldn't quite name. She set the porcelain cup in front of Joe with a polite nod. "Thank you," Joe said, meeting her gaze briefly. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Amara stepped back, unaware that her simple gesture had just altered the course of her life. The meeting resumed, but Jonathan's tone had changed. His questions grew sharper, his smile tighter. Each reply Joe offered seemed to heighten the tension until the air felt thick enough to touch. By the time the meeting concluded, the polite smiles exchanged across the table carried the weight of words unsaid. Joe Rogan shaking hands with each executive before turning toward the door. As he passed Amara, he paused just long enough to offer her a quick nod. "Thanks for the coffee," he said simply. She returned his smile, just a small, polite curve of her lips. But Jonathan saw it, and as the door closed behind Joe Rogan, Jonathan stood in the center of the conference room, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the spot where Amara had stood. His eyes narrowed slightly. A decision had been made. Hours later, as dust settled over the city, Amara sat at her desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she finalized the meeting minutes. Beyond the glass walls of the office, the city's lights flickered against the darkening sky, But inside, the hum of printers and faint conversations created a cocoon of routine. "Amara," a voice called from behind her. She turned to find Jonathan standing in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the corridor lights. "Come to my office," he said. Confused, she saved her work and followed him down the hallway. His office, larger than most city apartments, overlooked the skyline with floor-to-ceiling windows that cast long shadows across the sleek furniture. Jonathan closed the door and gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down." She obeyed, her pulse quickening as he took his seat. His expression was unreadable, hands steepled together as he regarded her in silence. "Effective immediately," he said without preamble. "Your employment with Sterling Dynamics is terminated." The words struck her like a punch, stealing the air from her lungs. "What? Why?" Jonathan's eyes didn't waver. "Your behavior during today's meeting was unprofessional and inappropriate. Your interaction with Mr. Rogan was noticed." "Interaction?" The blood roared in her ears. "I poured him a cup of coffee. That's it. And in doing so, you compromised the authority I worked to establish in that room." Jonathan replied smoothly. "Your familiarity sent the wrong message." "This is about your ego," Amara said before she could stop herself. Jonathan's smile vanished. "Careful, Miss Johnson." She stood, her pulse hammering in her chest. "You're firing me because you don't like Joe Rogan." Jonathan stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them until only inches separated them. His presence was sharp, suffocating. "Your termination is final. Pack your things and leave the premises." Silence crackled between them, thick with words unsaid. Finally, Amara turned toward the door, her steps heavy with disbelief. Just as she reached the handle, Jonathan's voice cut through the air like a blade. "And Miss Johnson, remember this moment the next time you think about stepping out of line." She paused, her fingers curling into a fist against the cold metal. But she didn't turn back. Instead, she stepped into the hallway, the sound of the door closing behind her, echoing like the final note of a closing chapter. As she walked down the corridor, her breath unsteady, one thought burned through the haze of anger and disbelief. This isn't over. The night air was cool against Amara's skin as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the cardboard box clutched tightly in her arms. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions swirling inside her. But as she turned toward the street, a familiar voice cut through the noise of the city. "Leaving for the night?" Amara's head snapped up and her breath caught in her throat. Joe Rogan stood a few steps away, hands in the pockets of his dark coat, his sharp gaze flicking from the box in her arms to her face. "Mr. Rogan," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Joe," he corrected with a small smile. His eyes searched hers. "You're leaving the company?" Amara swallowed hard. I was let go." Joe's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet concern. "Because of what happened in the meeting?" "It's complicated," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Joe stepped closer, his posture calm but purposeful. "Listen, I don't know the whole story, but from what I saw, you were just doing your job. And if that got you fired, well, that's not right." Amara's grip on the box tightened. "Jonathan Ellis didn't see it that way," she muttered, her gaze dropping to the pavement. "Ellis?" Joe's voice hardened slightly. "Let me guess, control freak with a god complex?" A surprised laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. "Something like that." Joe's smile returned, faint but genuine. "Come on, let me buy you a coffee. I think we need to talk." They sat at a small cafe a few blocks away, the warm glow of the lights casting a soft sheen on the polished wood table between them. Joe stirred his coffee thoughtfully, then set the spoon aside and leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with hers. "You didn't deserve what happened back there," he said, his voice steady. "And I don't think it's something you should just accept." Amara exhaled slowly. "I don't know what I can do. He's the CEO. His word is final." "That doesn't mean you don't have options," Joe replied. Silence hung between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time since she'd left Sterling Dynamics, Amara felt a glimmer of hope. Joe took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down with deliberate care. "You know, I could use someone like you on my team." Amara blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Excuse me." "I mean it," Joe said, his smile faint but encouraging. You're sharp, professional, and you've got integrity. That's not easy to find. I've got a lot of projects in the works, and I could use someone who knows how to handle pressure. Think about it. Amara stared at him, her mind racing. Only hours ago, her world had seemed to collapse around her. Now this man, someone whose presence had unwittingly turned her life upside down, was offering her a chance at something new. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Joe's smile softened. "Because I know what it's like to be underestimated, and I know how powerful it is when someone believes in you." Amara's throat tightened with emotion, but she managed a shaky smile. I need to think about it," she said at last. Joe nodded as if he'd expected that. "Take your time, but just know, the offer stands." Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below.